Okay, so finally then we have the article from Anna Karastathis. And by the way, I didn't mean to make 3 videos. It just somehow has turned out this way. Karastathis' article is much more recent, basically, and it's meant as a kind of survey, basically, of the concept of intersectionality, how that's been used and understood in feminist theory, basically. It's very useful, therefore. She talks about some of its origins. She talks a fair bit about Crenshaw, talks about just some of its conceptual elements, but she also gives a fairly strong critique or criticism of at least some of the ways in which this concept has been understood. So, for example, when she's talking about Crenshaw, and here she is referring to that other article, not the one we looked at, but a different one, also available on Blackboard if you wish, where she distinguishes, for example, the political, the structural, the political, and the representational dimensions of intersectionality. Basically, with the first, more or less refers to the reality of oppression, of multidimensional oppression in society. Political, referring more to how people might form alliances across those differences in order to more effectively struggle against oppression. And the representational sense, more in along the lines of how we understand sort of our concepts or even images that we may have that are relevant to this. In some ways, that can seem perhaps the least important, you might say, but for our purposes here in feminist philosophy, it might actually be the most important. So you'll see, for example, Karastathis then kind of elaborating some of the main conceptual elements, some of the things that at least officially the idea of intersectionality is supposed to address, right, in terms of what she calls simultaneity, how oppressions in different forms occur in certain women's lives simultaneously, complexity, how they interweave with one another, possibly amplify the negative effects of one another, irreducibility, how we can't simply sort of separate them out as per that additive model and imagine that ultimately they're just a set of discrete forms of oppression. And inclusivity, well, that's part of the goal, to try to pull back together into a more unified form the relevant constituency of feminism, basically. So that's all very useful, I think, to look at and to see in those terms, but part of Karastathis' point is really to put forward a fairly strong criticism of how, at least in many cases, the notion of intersectionality has been understood. And this is then partly why it may be the case that the representational sense is so important, because she thinks even though people kind of get it, they understand what they're supposed to be doing or what this concept is supposed to be helping us with, they nonetheless still, kind of at a deeper level in their thinking, remain on that single axis model, that there are a set of discrete forms of oppression which then we just add up, basically, that we put together. Even suggesting that the very metaphor of intersecting things implies that they are ultimately separable, basically. And she wants to say that's not really what it was ever meant to do. She's kind of going back to Crenshaw and thinking that's never really what she meant in putting this forward, right? What she really meant, basically, as we put with I think I mentioned with respect to Crenshaw and her basement model, that the real implication is much more far-reaching than that, that really we've got to stop and go about thinking and analyzing oppression in a very different way, basically anchoring ourselves really in the lived experience of multidimensional oppression, precisely in order to get a good handle on it at all. That to the extent that we fail to do that, we are basically inevitably probably going to make some simplifying assumptions that probably tie into oppression, basically, and its conceptual structure in some way or other, that we really need to sort of re-found, right, re-anchor our approach to things on the lived experience of intersecting or multidimensional oppression in order not to basically make those mistakes. And in order to come up with sort of a perspective that would be most effective in terms of understanding and ultimately in terms of organizing against oppression such as it is. So do think about here it's relevant, that basement analogy that I mentioned with Crenshaw. Just kind of think about what that might mean and how, at least from Karastathis' point of view, and she thinks she's just amplifying things found in Crenshaw, really points to that as a fundamentally different way of thinking about oppression, as if we really got to kind of start over from that